Jewish Channel's Week in Review. Palestine wins overwhelmingly at the United Nations, honoring those who helped after Hurricane Sandy, an off-Broadway look at a Birthright Israel participant, and more of the Jewish news that's changing your world right now in this episode of the Week in Review. Hello, and welcome to the Jewish Channel's Week in Review. I'm Stephen I. Weiss. Micronesia, Nauru, Palau, Panama, Marshall Islands, Czech Republic, Canada, and the United States. Those are the 8 countries that voted alongside Israel to oppose recognizing Palestine as a non-member observer state at the United Nations General Assembly last week. Compared to that 9 against, there were 138 votes in favor and 41 abstentions. The vote highlights the increasing diplomatic isolation of Israel and its current government on the world stage. Even when looking just 1 year ago, when a similar vote was held at UNESCO that was also extremely in favor of recognizing Palestine as a state, Israel has lost 5 votes for its preferred result and seen an overall shift of more than 20 countries moving from either voting against to abstention or abstention to voting for Palestinian recognition. Even the more traditional allies of Israel and the United States have switched their votes in just the past year. Denmark went from abstaining to a vote in favor, as did Italy, Sweden, and Portugal. Switching from voting against to abstain were Germany, Lithuania, and the Netherlands. With all of these vote changes just among European countries, a majority of the members of the European Union have now voted against the favored policies of the Israeli government and for those of Palestine. When Israel came into existence as a Jewish state, it was in part as a result of a vote in which the majority of the UN General Assembly, dozens of countries, supported the partition plan. A year ago, those supporting the diplomatic vision of the Israeli government was slightly more than a dozen. You could count them on your fingers and toes. Today, with just 9 votes, you can count all the countries that share the current Israeli government's vision of the peace process on just your fingers and have 1 left over. What are the practical implications of this vote? No one's really sure. Theoretically, Palestine's new status would allow it to push for war crimes charges to be levied against Israelis at the International Criminal Court. It could also mean that the ICC could be used as leverage against settlement building in the West Bank. But what is most clear is that this vote solidifies the status both of Palestine within the international community and of the Fatah-led Palestinian Authority within the Palestinian population. Coming less than 2 weeks after Fatah rival Hamas increased its hand with a large-scale rocket and missile campaign against Israel, this move for recognition by the UN General Assembly is a major power grab. And it's a power grab by a democratically elected leadership in the West Bank that has surprised many with its emphasis on economic development and internal security, while proving its ability to keep attacks against Israel from its population to nearly 0. The Israeli government responded to this move by increasing settlement building in the so-called E1 area between eastern Jerusalem and the West Bank settlement of Ma'ale Adumim, and by withholding hundreds of millions of dollars of Palestinian tax revenues. These efforts surprised the Israeli government's staunchest ally throughout all of this, the administration of President Barack Obama here in the United States. A spokesperson for the State Department declared of the settlement building, quote, "We have made clear to the Israeli government that such action is contrary to U.S. policy." Compare the rest of the statement to Obama's statements a couple of weeks ago when he was absolutely unequivocal in condemning Hamas rocket attacks and in suggesting it was Israel's right to use whatever reasonable means it deemed necessary in response. Here we see a much more even-handed statement. The United States and the international community expect all parties to play a constructive role in efforts to achieve peace. We urge the parties to cease unilateral actions and take concrete steps to return to direct negotiations. Within Europe, the tone was not as balanced, widely condemning these Israeli actions, while again, a majority of European Union members had just voted for Palestine at the General Assembly. Moving on to a topic in which members of the Jewish community are generating controversy within the United States, the efforts to stifle accusations of abuse and criminal activity within the Ultraorthodox community. The trial of a counselor accused of molesting underage clients recently began in Brooklyn. The accused, Nehemiah Weberman, has received a great amount of support from Ultraorthodox rabbis and leaders. A major fundraiser for his legal defense was attended by many prominent community members. Already, though, his trial has led to the arrests of 4 members of his community. When an anonymous witness accusing Weberman took the stand, the teenage girl was photographed by several men. The judge ordered 4 men arrested and all cell phones confiscated for the duration of the trial. That's how some lay people are responding, but how about leaders? Well, one of the two rebbes of the Satmar Hasidic sect, Rabbi Aaron Teitelbaum, reportedly addressed the Weberman trial in a speech over the weekend, condemning the 17-year-old accuser who claims Weberman molested her when she was 12. Teitelbaum is reported to have said, quote, "It is terrifying a Jewish daughter has descended so low." He then added a quote from the Torah portion asking, "Is our sister to be like a whore?" Teitelbaum also reportedly said, quote, "The devil has succeeded." Moving on to a story about the Jewish community helping those who've fallen on hard times. An event to celebrate those who assisted others in the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy was held on Tuesday, and Christian Needon was there.
It was a night to honor the heroes of Hurricane Sandy this past Tuesday, as the Metropolitan Council on Jewish Poverty organized a recognition event in downtown Manhattan to highlight those people and organizations working to help New Yorkers recover from the worst natural disaster in city history. Met Council CEO Willie Rapfogel explained why the night's honorees deserved public recognition for their efforts.
Because while their own homes were underwater, while their families were being displaced, they stayed behind and did a whole variety of things for their community, from making sure people had hot meals, to delivering food to shut-ins, to making sure that, like some volunteer ambulance folks, they went up to the 15th floor of apartment buildings, carried people down as volunteers, making sure that there was childcare for people who needed it, who had to go to work. Some of them collected furniture that people could live with. Others made arrangements for people to have alternative housing. They deserve it.
Met Council Residence Director Dina Johnson coordinated the evacuation of many of the 116 low-income seniors living in two Met Council buildings in Seagate, Brooklyn.
I had to evacuate 75 seniors that I still can't get home at this point. So what I've been doing is basically taking care of my people that stayed home, that refused to evacuate. I've been taking care of them. I've been doing cleanup. I've been lifting boards and everything and throwing it into sanitation trucks, whatever necessary to get my people back home.
Josh Comer and Debbie Burak are neighbors in Willowbrook on central Staten Island and decided to drive around flooded regions to offer help where they could.
We all went down, drove around, saw what was going on, saw that people needed everything from just a shoulder to cry on at that point, to just, some cleaning supplies. People needed basic things like just a jacket to wear. People were evacuated from their houses or ran out of their houses with nothing.
They needed everything from clothing, coats, boots, to food, to a place to live. Some people needed dry ice for their medication. We needed formula, diapers for babies, places for people to sleep. I mean, you name it, they needed it.
To see more from the Met Council's Sandy Heroes recognition event, please tune into the full broadcast edition of the Week in Review.
Thank you, Christian. There's a new Off Broadway show featuring a recent Birthright Israel attendee. Meredith Gansman has that story.
Landed home from Israel at 2 in the morning and had rehearsal for this 10 a.m. the next day.
Dedication.
I know.
This is Bear, a rock musical about teenagers in a Catholic high school dealing with conflicting sexual identities and religious convictions. But before Sarah Kapner tackled the role of Madison, a popular student and often a school bully, she traveled to Israel on a Tagli Birthright trip.
Israel is like the best place in the world, kind of. Just had like the best time. It's such a beautiful country, and like everybody was like telling me how great it was and how connected they feel to Judaism and everything. And I was like, okay, whatever. And then I went and I was like, oh, I get it now. This is really what it's all about.
For Kapner, Having a strong connection to her faith helped her to handle the difficult themes in Bear.
Especially because I came from such a wonderful community of Jews, and so accepting and so loving, and I mean, I have such a close relationship with the rabbi and the cantor at my temple. My cantor taught me how to sing, so I never felt that kind of pressure. So I kind of had to pull in from other things to feel that like weight bearing down on me. Mm-hmm. If anything, it kind of helped me let go of that a little bit, because I saw in Israel just everybody was so loving to each other.
If I told you, would it even matter? If I showed you where I hide my heart.
And finding acceptance under strict religious beliefs is the core issue that Bear is stripping down.
God being the only one you can turn to in times of trouble, but what if you are something that God says is wrong?
Choreographer Travis Wall found this struggle easy to relate to.
I pretty much pulled from my life. Everything I felt in those dark years, and I felt in a black hole and no one was listening to me and no one heard me, and I couldn't speak to anybody. I felt like these kids.
To see more from Sarah Kapner and the cast and creative team of Bear, tune into the full broadcast version of the Week in Review.
We gave the world a chance to what? To see how deep the world can cut.
Thank you, Meredith. Finally, how should we view the legacy of Jews in sports? The editor of The New Republic, Franklin Foer, and one of his writers, Mark Tracy, have co-edited a book that gathers a dream team of Jewish writers and intellectuals to tackle that topic. They recently stopped by our studio for an interview, and here are the highlights. So, we'll get to the controversy behind this book in a moment, but
controversy.
We'll get to that in a moment. But anytime a book like this comes out, I mean, one of the first things that really comes to mind as you flip through the pages and you read through all the pieces, all the profiles of all these athletes, is that you realize there really is a substantial population of great Jewish athletes in America.
Yeah, that's exactly right. There's this joke that has been told from time immemorial about how we're not good at sports. Well, it turns out if you string it all together and you look at it as a whole, we're pretty good. And furthermore, if you look at the aggregate contribution that Jews have made to the world of sports, it's something like the Jewish contribution to Hollywood or popular culture or to law. We've really played a massive role in shaping not just what happens on the field, although we've played a substantial role in that, but the whole culture and business of sports is something that has a very strong Jewish imprint.
Right, but that's what I'll call the controversial part. The idea. So you title the book "Jewish Jocks."
Yes.
And then among your list of jocks, you include names like Howard Cosell, executives and coaches, people who.
Daniel Okren, the ultimate.
Daniel Okren, right.
He's actually a great way to talk about this because he's literally the ultimate Jewish nerd and the ultimate Jewish schlemiel. And Daniel Okren is, he was a great editor,
I don't
great
think
journalist.
he would call himself a schlemiel, but.
Well, we call him one. So, one reason we call him that is because he invented fantasy sports. Specifically, he invented rotisserie baseball, which is the type of fantasy baseball that people play to this day. And he's never won his league, despite presiding over the first ever fantasy draft, which is where the schlemiel aspect gets into it. But so here's a guy, right. The last thing you'd take him for if you saw him, sitting in his sweater and talking about baseball in the Ken Burns documentary is a jock.
He looks like one of us.
He is one of us. But at the same time, he is a Jewish jock because, in the way Frank was talking about, he has influenced the way, sports are consumed in America, much as the way that Jack Warner influenced the way that movies are consumed in America. And he turned, as Jonathan Mahler, who writes the Okren essay, says, he turned us into a nation of number-loving Jewish sports fans.
Well, I don't know if he turned us into a nation of number-loving Jewish sports fans. He gave a seemingly productive outlet for number-obsessed Jewish sports fans. I mean, it is fascinating how fantasy sports have taken over from just the small, humble beginnings of Daniel Okren typing things up on a little sheet of paper and handing it out to a bunch of magazine editors in New York. And now you turn on ESPN and you can't get 5 minutes without a mention of fantasy something or other.
Fantasy, I think, is at the core of our relationship to sports more generally. And I think it goes to the heart of the reason why Jews identify so strongly with Jewish athletes. I mean, I think that you see Super Jew Mike Epstein out there at the plate hitting home runs. I mean, I think that there's a sense at which, especially if you're one of our writers, which means that you're probably a nerdy Jewish guy or a nerdy Jewish woman, that you're not just identifying with Super Jew Mike Epstein as a proxy for you, this guy who's going out and fighting on your behalf. There's some sense that this guy is living the dream, and that you can identify with this guy because he's also Jewish.
He gets to play baseball for a living.
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
And it's funny because you actually assemble maybe a dream team of Jewish writers, of exactly everyone who everybody's reading in D.C. and New York, from Jeffrey Goldberg to David Plotz, the two of you, and so many more of these writers, and they all really love sport. They all feel like they really love sports, and it feels like, in a lot of ways, this is like one big love letter from the Jews of journalism to plus Larry Summers and some others.
You know, we did a panel with Larry Summers in Boston the other week, and he said the day that he was asked to write for a volume on Jewish sports was the happiest day of his life.
Because it just makes. Why do you think it makes Jews so happy? Right? To be thinking about sports, talking about sports, that's something that's not really explored. Like
there's certainly a time when the reason it makes them happy, or conversely makes them unhappy and creates a real tension, is because it's assimilation. And actually, we begin the book talking about how sports meant assimilation, which meant, of course, back in the day that sports were evil because assimilation was evil. And the American story the American story generally is of course the melting pot story, the assimilation. Every ethnic group, I think, has their claim to this, but for various reasons, the Jews' specific claim to this, I think, is that they didn't just assimilate. They didn't just move, it's the mountain to Muhammad, Muhammad to the mountain, to use a slightly weird religious analogy. Moses to the mountain. Sure, we moved to the mountain, but we also moved the mountain a little to us, fantasy being a great example. Boxing and basketball, which were sports that in their early days in the first decades of the 20th century were predominantly Jewish sports. We Jews also changed those sports in a way that forced everyone else to catch up. So yes, there was a melting pot going on, but it was going on both ways. So I think that the reason Jews like it now, it's a combination of that impulse, and I think a combination still of vestigial insecurity to some extent, which, as we argue, is unwarranted.
Well, I think it goes, when you come to the subject of Jews and sports, you're getting shockingly close to the center of the Jewish psyche. And that's because when anti-Semites in the rest of Europe portrayed Jews through the ages, the depiction was one of weak, effeminate, bookish, wan men who couldn't get out of the ghetto and breathe fresh air. And Zionism reacted against that idea by embracing it to a certain extent and arguing that in order for the Jewish people to be redeemed, they needed to redeem their own bodies. And there was a whole Jewish movement in sports that set out to redeem the Jewish body. And it was very, very much connected to the wider Zionist project.
You can see the full interview with Franklin Foer and Mark Tracy under the Weekly News category on the Jewish Channel On Demand on cable. That's all for this week from all of us here at the Jewish Channel. Be well. The Jewish Channel is available on cable. Time Warner Cable Channel 528, IO Optimum Channel 291, RCN Channel 268, Bright House Channel 330, Verizon Fios Channel 900, Cox Channel 1, Frontier Communications, and now on Comcast Cable in the on-demand menu under Premium Channels. For more information, visit tjctv.com.